Hi, this is Mrs. Camp, and I'm looking at AP World History. We're going to be talking about 1.6 develops in Europe from 1200 to 1450. Some of the events we talk about, however, and the historical developments are before 1200. Learning objectives for this topic are explain how the beliefs and practices of the predominant religions in Europe affected European society. Explain the causes and consequences of political decentralization in Europe from circa 1200 to circa 1450, and to explain the effects of agriculture on social organization in Europe from 1200 to 1450. The image we're looking at right now is a graph of invasions into the Roman Empire, which shows that over time, Rome was repeatedly invaded and the Western Roman Empire fell and fragmented into many different pieces. That happened in 476 is the official date we talk about, and this is where we say Europe entered the Middle Ages. At this point, trade declined, as did connection with outside of Europe, and intellectual life receded. Rome was replaced by smaller kingdoms who were at odds with each other, and each one wanted to control the territory of each other. Therefore, we had lots of little wars, or bigger wars. Only the Catholic Church remained powerful in Europe, and this is a continuity through the 16th century. Learning and trade began to revive, however, between 1000 and 1450 in what we call the High Middle Ages. So I want you to stop for a moment and explain the causes of decentralization in Europe. Pause the video and then continue. Okay, so let's take a look at feudalism, which is the system that developed after the fall of Rome. Okay, it is decentralized. Power was devolved, meaning that power came from the central level down to the local levels. The local elites were in charge, be they nobles, church officials, city councils, knights, and each authority had different kinds of power, and so power was fractured during this time. Since there was not a strong government, people did need protection. Bandits, rival lords, invaders such as Vikings, and so the system of feudalism developed. The official definition of feudalism here, political organization based on a system of exchanges of land for loyalty, relationship between local leaders and kings. I suggest that you pause, write down about the decentralization and the definition of feudalism. At the core of feudalism is mutual obligations. The monarch, usually a king, became a king's vassal, and pledged to that vassal, or pledged to the king, which we call fealty, was in return for some land, which we call a fief. The lord then owed loyalty and service to the king. Lords then would provide land to knights. The knights would then become the vassals to the lord, and the knights would pledge to fight for the lord or the king. The lord also provided land and protection to peasants, as did a knight. The peasants are obligated to farm the lord's land, provide the lord with crops and livestock, and obey the lord's or knight's orders. So feudalism provided security for peasants, equipment for lawyers, and land to anybody who served the king or a lord. And the entire system here is based on agriculture. There's also a code of chivalry that was incorporated into feudalism, which of course varied by the person or region, but the idea here is honor, courtesy, and bravery. And this is similar to the feudal system in Japan, where there were certain behaviors that were expected. Women here were to be protected. The code of chivalry put them on a pedestal, but when it comes down to it, women did not have a lot of rights. So please pause now and explain the system of feudalism in 1 or 2 complete sentences. The manorial system. So this coexisted with the feudal system. It's a political, religious, and economic unit. I usually refer to it as economic because that is the primary way to look at it. Large fiefs or estates were called manors, and this provided economic self-sufficiency and defense. The religious part of this is the church had significant part of the life and actually power over the lords. The bishops, for example, could suspend services. They could say, okay, there's going to be no mass, and that would make the serfs angry and put pressure on the Lord to do what the church wanted him to do. The manor produced everything that people needed, limited the need for trade and contact with outsiders. The grounds, small churches, blacksmith shop, mill, wine presses are what comprise the villages. Also, we have the peasant homes, and the peasants are known as serfs. Serfs are not slaves because they are not owned by a person, but they are rather tied to the land. So I want you to pause and think what kind of labor it is when someone is not allowed to leave an area and owes goods to the one above them. Okay, so this is a coerced labor system. The serfs could not travel or marry without permission from the lord. They did get the protection. They paid tribute in forms of crop labor. Once in a while, you'd find a case that was coins, but that was incredibly rare. And their children would also have that status. They would inherit the status of a serf. This is a picture of the manor. You can see here the fields that were plowed. We have the 3-field system where we have one field planted with one crop, a second field planted with the second crop, and the third lay fallow or unplanted. And this would often have a rotation of grain and some sort of a beans that would then provide nutrients back to the land. There's also a church, some houses. You see a place where there are horses. We've got a blacksmith shop. So there's a lot of things going on in the manor or in the estate surrounding the manor house. So the economy of Europe at this point was dependent on agriculture. Their prosperity and the manor was intricately tied to the harvest. Additionally, cities depended on the harvest from rural areas in order to grow. At the end of the Middle Ages, technology began to improve. There began to be more land and farming would improve. This did not happen throughout the majority of the Middle Ages. This was a late development. And I've explained the 3 field systems, one with wheat or rye, the second often with legumes, beans, and then the third one lays unused. Technological developments at the time, remember the technology and innovation theme we talk about, include windmills and new types of plows. So here we see both environmental interaction of people and we see technology coming into play there. And this is all part of the economic system. So we're going to pause a moment, and I want you to think about what an increase in agricultural productivity leads to and what it is that you know is happening after 1300 that complicates this and lowers productivity. Additionally, I want you to pause and in complete sentences explain the effects of political decentralization as we've seen it so far. So let's practice a stimulus-based multiple choice question, the kind that you will get on the exam. So we have a stimulus and we can look to find where that stimulus came from. And we're looking if it's a visual source, we're looking at who created it, when did they create it. This is a text-based source or a text source. So let's take a look at who wrote it and when, and figure out what we can about that person, which is the skill of sourcing. When you're sourcing something, you're finding out, well, what can you tell about the writer? And then you go in and analyze the text. Right now, we're going to stop at the person who wrote this. And we can tell this person's name, Jean Froissart. He was a French chronicler from the late 1300s. So what can we tell? We can tell that this person is from France. We can tell that late 1300s, so we're in the Middle Ages, but we're in the later Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages. So let's take a look at what this person is talking about specifically. And what we're going to do is we're going to read the first sentence and last sentence of this passage and see what we can figure out just from that. So the first sentence, at that time there happened great disturbances among the lower ranks of people, by which England was nearly ruined. The last sentence is, and if they were to do any work for their lords, they demanded to be paid for it. So think here about what knowledge we have that is applied to this. So we see the great disturbances in lower ranks of people. Okay, we know from that it's going to be peasants or serfs. Okay, and England was nearly ruined. At this point, we don't have any idea of what exactly was going on. But let's take some guesses and go forwards. Okay, the last sentence, and if they were to do any work for their lords, they demanded to be paid for it. Okay, so this lower group of people is demanding to be paid for their work. So with our knowledge, we can say, okay, we're talking about serfs here. So let's then take a look at the question. The events described in the passage represent a reaction against which of the following forms of coerced labor? So let's go through each of them to rule out the ones we know are wrong. Remember, when College Board gives you a question, sometimes the answers are right, sometimes they're out of the time frame of what's going on, which is why the years and understanding the period is so important. And also the location. So we're in England and we're in the late Middle Ages. So slavery, is this an option? Okay, it's not an option because slavery is not the issue that is going on in England in the late Middle Ages. So that is off. Military conscription, well, that's the draft. Is this appropriate? No, it's not. We're not dealing with a situation of conscription, and especially not conscription by the serfs who are demanding payment. So we know it's not conscription. Indentured servitude. At this period in time, is indentured servitude something that's happening in England? And it's not. We start getting indentured servitude later in time, and often tied to colonialism, which we will discuss at length. And that leaves us with serfdom. Well, we know this is going to be serfs, so just from who wrote it, when, and the first and last sentences, we know that this is a reaction against serfdom. So, serfdom represents a form of labor organization under which agricultural laborers were bound to the land and required to carry out customary duties on the landlord's estates. The English peasant revolt described in the passage was a reaction against the oppressive nature of these feudal obligations. And we'll actually look specifically at the peasant revolt shortly. So, demand for more labor on the manor is increasing, but the supply is decreasing. And pressures and constraints on the serf are increased. We'll look at why it's decreasing in a moment, but let's take a quick look at what's going on. So in the 13th century, serfs sought to ease conditions. They were using peaceful means largely, legal means largely. And the methods of resistance depended on the situation. Okay? There were very different means used between different locations, different conditions that people experienced. Why is this going on? Why are we having the more demands? Well, in part because of the plague. Okay, so there's a series of plagues coming through. In the 1300s, the plague, Black Death, got to England. It killed as much as a third of the population. And in England, most of the people were Christian, and one of the groups, or one of the reactions they had to the plague and to these deaths was to blame an outside group, and in this case, it was the Jews. We've got a situation where we've got a growing demand for labor and the deaths of so many people, and that led to the serfs gaining bargaining power. Okay. There's still some legal resistance, but there are occasional outbreaks of violence. So I want you to pause and think about what happens to agricultural productivity after the plague, and what will be the reactions to and result from the serfs gaining bargaining power. So we're predicting, and we're talking about a causal event. So I'd like you to write down in your notes what you think will happen. Okay, so this is a map giving you an idea of the timings of the plague, and that it came to different places at different times. If you look, it comes in down in the bottom right of the map. So in the southeastern area, it comes in through the Mediterranean. Also comes in through just the eastern area. You can see it coming in 1346 through the Black Sea, and that is coming from the Silk Roads. So we've got the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and it starts spreading west and northwest across Europe. And in around 1349 to 1350, it hits the northern European countries. We've got 1349, it's going into Spain, and 1350, we see it going through England. So, growing population plus plague equals reduced population, reduced agricultural output, and strain and demands on the laborers. So the effects of the increased demand seem to be some amount of flight of serfs from villages. They saw wage opportunities in other areas, but remember that we're still in an agricultural society. Okay, so they're going to other places. They may, if they're young, they may become an apprentice, but that happens very young. So their opportunities aren't a lot, but they do see, hey, I can actually get paid if I go somewhere else. So there is some amount of that. There are changes in social structure. We've got some free peasants going on, largely merchants, blacksmiths. The serfs demanded higher wages, and, well, peasants demanded higher wages and serfs demanded wages. There was a result of some increased freedom. They're not entirely subject to the will of the Lord, but there's not a real increase or benefit economically for the serfs. And we will see this again later in Russia in the 19th century. So I mentioned the Peasants' Rebellion. It's also known as WHAP's Rebellion of the Great Rising. Okay, this was um, a result of social instability. We've got the plague with the additional demands for labor. There's also the 100 Years' War going on that the government needs to fund and supply people in the war over in France. And the government had planned to impose additional taxes upon the peasants. So people are unhappy, and there began to be resistance that became violent. We're looking at serfs, free artisans, runaway apprentices. This is who's involved. And it started in London, but as other areas learned of this, it spread, and it spread across pretty much all of England. The effects of this, the leaders were tried for treason, killed, received harsh punishments. But the lords were afraid of further rebellions, and so the landowners generally did not punish the rest of the peasants. There was an official reinstatement of serfdom. However, serfdom began to decrease for economic reasons, not because of these revolts. And by the 15th century, serfdom is non-existent in England. See the picture at the right, that is a picture of the peasants' revolt, people working with the peasants not being so happy with the people. And we've got the passage actually that we looked at a couple minutes ago, which was specifically about the peasants' revolt. You can see at that time there had been great disturbances among the lower ranks of people, by which England was nearly ruined. Never was a country in such jeopardy, and all because some chroniclers sought to claim liberties to which they were not entitled. More about the peasants' revolt. Women were involved. Okay, women did take up arms, but their roles have historically been unknown because contemporary and later chroniclers, historians, did not believe that women would be anything except for mothers, and therefore they wouldn't be involved. And if they were involved, maybe the event would not be so significant. So there's a lot of attitudes going into why this specific event, why we don't know more about the women involved, and in general, resistance and women's involvement in it. However, current scholarship about this specific rebellion indicates that women and men did just about the same things. There's this quote I have here from Melissa Hogenboom, published in 2012, about the Peasants' Revolt. It was BBC News, and you can see women did, quote, almost everything that men did. They incited crowds, chased their enemies, and marched into London alongside the men. They were not shy to pick up staffs, sticks, and staves and wield them against perceived oppressors. And this is from an interview. So this is from Frederico, who is a historian. So some of the example of roles women were accused of, they encouraged a group to attack the prison at Maidstone in Kent, led rebels to plunder a number of mansions, leaving servants too scared to return. There were a wide range of activities, but there's not any evidence of women being punished to the same effect that men were, and there's no evidence of women being put to death as a result of this. So, because of the plagues, which cut down in the city size, and we now have something called the Little Ice Age, urban growth was decreased. What happens with the Little Ice Age is that there's the northern hemisphere experienced a reduced temperature over a period of about 5 centuries, and that we refer to as the Little Ice Age. So I'd like you to stop and think for a minute. What does a decrease in agricultural productivity lead to? And then I want you to predict the possible consequences of a decrease in average temperature. Go ahead and write down your responses. Okay, so the lower temperatures reduced agricultural productivity. Okay, people had less to trade, cities grew more slowly, as I mentioned. Additionally, there was an increase in disease and an increase in unemployment. There was social unrest, crime rate increased, wars increased. We had civil wars going on. We've got a lot of instability in the social, political, economic structures. Additionally, groups that already faced discrimination, such as Jews and Muslims, were the victims of scapegoating. They're being blamed for something that they had no control. The Jews did not cause, the Muslims did not cause the Little Ice Age, did not cause the lower productivity, yet they were targeted as being blamed for this. So let's look at a stimulus-based multiple choice question. It's the one that the passage we've just looked at. So we know again that this is the High Middle Ages. There's a French chronicler. This happened in England. We know that it was the serfs who were rebelling and demanding to be paid. The question, English nobles resisted peasant demands, such as those described in the passage, because agricultural labor in many parts of the 14th century in Afro-Eurasia had become scarce. And this was a result of which the following developments. Okay, so resistance to these demands. Passage seems to describe the demands. So let's think about what could cause the nobles to resist that. And so let's take a look. It's the migration of peasants to cities in search of industrial employment. Well, we don't have industrialization yet, so that's not possible. Significant increase in mortality due to the spread of epidemic diseases. Well, we've talked about the plague, and that additionally there was an uptick in disease due to the Little Ice Age. So we'll leave that as a maybe. The development of wage-based economies with the emergence of capitalism. We haven't talked a lot about types of economies other than this is agricultural. We haven't talked about systems such as capitalism, socialism, etc. But we know that there are demands for wages, but we don't know if any of them were granted. So this would be a probably not. If you know that capitalism doesn't exist at this point, you can cross it off. But if you don't know that, you can still say probably not. Okay? And the last one, widespread famine from rising global temperatures. That is very obviously not true because we know that temperatures aren't rising here. So it brings us back to B and C. B, we said, could absolutely be. C was a probably not. So let's gut level go with B. And so that's correct. Beginning in the early 1300s, increasing in intensity over the century, epidemic diseases such as the Black Death, so not only the Black Death, decimated much of the labor force in Western Europe, temporarily improving the bargaining positions of peasants and artisans who survived. So let's just take a little bit more of a look at economic and social changes, then we're going to look at the political system. So, a small Jewish population in Christian Europe began to grow. Many of the Jews lived in Muslim areas in the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal, and around the Mediterranean Sea. And this is the inside of a synagogue in Spain. Here we are looking at the outside of a synagogue in Toledo, Spain. Obviously, this is a present-day picture. So, as we said, Jewish populations are beginning to grow, and with the plague and some Christian intolerance, there was widespread anti-Semitism, and that increased. So the Christians thought of Jews as outsider, untrustworthy. They were blamed for the plague and for other diseases and bad events that go on. And over time, the Jews are increasingly expelled from different parts of Europe. England in 1290, France, depending on the area, we've got it over a period of time, some before expulsion from England, some after, ultimately full expulsion in 1394. Spain in 1492 at the finish of the Reconquista. We have the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Portugal, 5 years later, a lot of the Jews had fled to Portugal, and then Portugal said, no, we don't want the Jews here either. And they often moved north and east to Eastern Europe. So we've got Jews moving north and east, but it's important to note that the Roman Catholic Church had a policy that Christians could not charge interest on loans to other Christians. Jews were not bound by this, and Jews were limited in the occupations they could have. So many of the Northern European Jews became moneylenders, which then, having the moneylenders, leads to an increase in the flow of money, which then leads to an increase in economic growth. So while there's this anti-Semitism, there are benefits to the general population from the Jews being there. Muslims also face discrimination. This picture is from Spain under Alfonso X, and his father had instituted some anti-Muslim measures, but still the Muslims, especially because Alfonso was interested in learning, there is still a lot of interaction with Muslims. There's not an expulsion at this point. In 1492, the Spanish king expelled the remaining Muslims who wouldn't convert, much like they expelled the Jews. So as you can see, Muslims faced a lot of discrimination. They also received the blame for a lot of things, and many of them moved to southeastern Europe. So we've got the Muslims moving to southeastern Europe, and at the same time, the Seljuk Turk Empire has broken up and the Ottoman Empire has formed. So between the 13th and 15th century, the Ottoman Empire, which was Muslim, expanded from Turkey into Balkan areas of Albania, Kosovo, Bosnia, and Herzegovina. That those areas developed large Muslim populations. So if you're looking at the map, the Ottoman Turks are that small brown area, and then the Ottomans acquired the orange area and the yellow area and then the purple area. And as they went up in the yellow area, here we have the Balkan areas that they start to take over. Additionally, while Europe is predominantly Christian, and despite the fact that they are being persecuted, Jews and Muslims both help shape society. Jews lived in urban areas and served as a bridge between Christians and Muslims. And the Christians wanted Muslim goods that they could get. The Jewish contacts with traders in Muslim caliphates opened up a huge amount of trade and ideas for Europeans who had long been self-sufficient and very isolated under feudalism. Women in Europe, women found their rights eroding. We've got patriarchal thinking, patriarchal writing. I mentioned what was going on with the women in the Peasants' Revolt. We have a society that's starting to move from agricultural to urban. We've got women. Women have a less education than men. They weren't taught. Women did offer manage the accounts on their manor. Not all women, all areas had property rights. And in England, we have what we'll talk about on my next video of primogeniture. There were some opportunities. For example, they could display skills in administration and in leadership in religious orders. We've got convents where nuns lived and led their community. And if you're familiar with monasteries, convents are the female equivalent. Women also became artisans and guild members, guilds being the groups that controlled trade or production and trade of a certain item. Women in Islamic societies had much more equality, much higher level overall, and particularly parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. So this is the end of this video. The second part, we're going to look at Russia and the church and political developments in the late Middle Ages.